Welcome to Panel 2B, Personal, Racial, and Ideational Encounters. Our first speaker will be Johaina Katinka B. Crisostomo from the University of California, Berkeley. She will be presenting the NeoScholastic origins binding the revolutionary philosophies of the Philippines and Spanish America. Our second speaker will be Arthit Jiamrattanyoo from the University of Washington, Seattle, presenting Transimperial knowledge and the politics of interracial friendship in the European colonization of the Philippines. Our last speaker for today will be Ana M. Rodriguez from the University of Iowa. Sorry, our last speaker for this panel. Her paper will be Reencountering Islam in Mindanao, Race and Religion at the Threshold of Spain's Modernity. Okay, so once again, everyone, please switch off your video and audio to give way to the presenters, and questions will be entertained after everyone has spoken. Okay, and without further ado, let's have Johaina to present her paper. Okay, Johaina, are you ready?
Hi. Oh, sorry. You can see me, right?
Yes, we can see you and
okay,
we can hear
cool.
you.
Awesome. Before I want to start, I just wanted to thank the organizers of the conference for allowing me to share this work in progress. It's especially exciting for me to be able to talk at a conference hosted by my father's alma mater. So thank you so much for the opportunity. In this presentation, I offer an intellectual history of Emilio Jacinto's vernacular political theology, Liwanag at Dilim, or Light and Darkness, which ties it to a longer tradition of Spanish Catholic political thought from the Counter-Reformation to the 1812 Cortes of Cadiz to the Philippine Revolution. I should say from the outset that my interest in Jacinto and on Philippine revolutionary philosophy at large is part of a dissertation project that looks at the translation of these political philosophies into the Tagalog, Spanish, and English novels of the American period. I realized in my research that a number of early 20th century Philippine novels continue to revert back to the vernacular political theologies of such revolutionary thinkers as Jacinto and Apolinario Mabini to grapple with the American occupation. Thus, in order to understand the novels, I found that I needed to understand the philosophies on which they were based. It was in my study of Jacinto's work, however, that I discovered that we don't quite yet have an adequate account of the intellectual genealogy of his thinking. That is, while extolled for their aesthetic value, Jacinto's writings are often not scrutinized for their philosophical content. Moreover, the few monographs that have endeavored to trace out the intellectual origins of his corpus foreground a Jacinto that was first and foremost a, quote, product of the European Enlightenment, primarily emphasizing the influence of a French brand of liberalism on Jacintian thought. What continually gets downplayed is the profound impact of 19th century Spanish liberalism and its roots in the neo-scholasticism of the Counter-Reformation. Indeed, a more historically far-reaching picture could be drawn if we were to acknowledge the large silent wellspring of Catholic political philosophy that informed Jacinto's vernacular political theology. As I argue in this paper, in spite of his very real anti-clericalism, Jacinto mobilized what were essentially tenets of Catholic political thought to counter a Spanish Catholic regime, reappropriating imperial political theology for his own revolutionary ends, which, as Vicente Rafael has pointed out, was the same case for Mabini. I also want to clarify that in highlighting the scholastic foundations of Jacinto's philosophy, I do not wish to deny that he wasn't also influenced by the French Enlightenment. The events of the French Revolution clearly impacted the Philippines' own rupture from Spain, as evidenced by the direct reference to Louis XVI's decapitation in Liwanag at Dilim's section on Ang Tao'y Magkakapantay, or Men Are Equal. Yet the current scholarship on Jacinto has emphasized this and only this, when in fact his work represents a hybrid of sorts. In Liberty and Love, the Political and Ethical Philosophy of Emilio Jacinto, Rolando Gripaldo is right to observe Aristotelian echoes in Jacinto's work, because St. Thomas Aquinas built his entire theology on an Aristotelian framework. Likewise, Gripaldo finds Lockean and Rousseauian resemblances, precisely because, as Quentin Skinner has famously argued, Locke's and Rousseau's conceptions of the natural law theory of the state and the social contract were themselves taken from the 16th century Spanish NeoScholastics, who I argue to be Jacinto's primary intellectual progenitors. The particular texture of Liwanag at Dilim indeed demonstrate a liberalism that is more Spanish rather than French, revealing greater affinities with the philosophies that inform the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. In his own groundbreaking study of Spanish-American intellectual history, Raul Coronado foregrounds the need to acknowledge, quote, an alternative model of modernity that has its roots in Catholic thought, end quote, in approaching the revolutionary imaginaries of the Hispanic world. Coronado asserts, quote, if scholasticism by the late 18th century had become a minor figure in the intellectual world of primarily Protestant Northwestern Europe, that was far from being the case in the Hispanic world, end quote. Indeed, to my mind, it would be more accurate to think of the Philippine Revolution as the last Latin American independence movement instead of a Southeast Asian repercussion of the one that rocked France. The fact is, Emilio Jacinto's conception of political authority, as expounded upon in Liwanag at Dilim's section on Ang Bayan at ang mga Pinuno, or the people and the government, is staunchly based on scholastic natural law. The natural law conception of the state dates back to an entire body of political thought developed by the Catholic theologians of the Spanish Counter-Reformation to challenge, among other things, the Protestant notion of the divine right of kings and the justification for the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Jesuit theologian Francisco Suarez distinguished himself among the schoolmen by taking the scholastic doctrine of popular sovereignty to new heights through the mechanism of consent. Suarez argues that political power originates from the people as a whole in their consensual coming together to form a political community, and thus cannot exist in or be generated by any one individual man. Citing Aquinas, he asserts that the authority of the king, far from embodying a direct conferral of divine grace, is actually derived from the sovereignty of the entire people who have willfully transferred their collective natural rights to him. Thus, political historian Haro Hopeful speaks of the essential dual nature of this Suarezian social contract, the first pact being that between the members of society and their agreement to form the perfect community with each other, and the second being that between the people and their chosen ruler or rulers in their decision to surrender their collective political power to this ruling entity, i.e., the Suarezian doctrine of pactum translationis. For Suarez, the only way for the people to regain this power once the transfer has been made is that the ruling regime suddenly proves itself to endanger the very lives it was instituted to protect, thus making a case for a valid form of tyrannicide and popular revolution. As Hopeful contends, an irreducible sovereignty therefore remains with the community as a fundamentally inalienable right to self-defense. The influence of Suarez on 19th century Philippine revolutionary thinking could be explained by the profound impact of the 1812 Cortes of Cadiz, which sought to modernize Spain politically and constitutionally by adapting old Habsburg ruling principles to help the Spanish dominions around the world reclaim power from the usurping French king Joseph Bonaparte. As demonstrated by historians of Hispanic political thought, the theory of sovereignty that dominated in the debates of Cadiz was precisely the Suarezian collectivistic interpretation of the term. That is, instead of a concept of the social contract as the product of individuals transferring political rights they already possessed as individual men and women in order to participate in civil society, what was promulgated was a vision of political power itself, being created only at the moment of the people's union. Mobilizing Suarez's interpretation of an indivisible collectivistic political power, the juntas that convened in Cadiz claimed Joseph's authority invalid since he wasn't willfully chosen by the peoples he purported to subjugate. Thus, marshalling scholastic political principles, they asserted that a tyrant on the throne meant a nullification of power and the presumed reversion of authority back to the people, the bona fide source of all sovereignty according to natural law. As Coronado writes, the Cortes produced a new constitution for a suddenly altered Spanish world, one that would serve as the touchstone for Hispanic liberalism throughout the 19th century, end quote. Significantly for our study, the 1812 Cortes was the one time in all of Spanish Philippine history that the Philippines was granted representation in the Spanish parliament. Yet even some of the most prominent historians of the Philippine Revolution interpret the sudden advancement of the Philippines' political status as the triumph of liberalism in Spain, and by liberalism, they mean specifically the French strain. But as just explained, the creation of the Cortes embodied a resuscitation of older Habsburg political beliefs that were consciously opposed to the French-influenced Bourbon reforms. Thus, as intellectual historian Carlos Stotzer argues, the Spanish War of Independence represented, more than a struggle against a foreign invader, a veritable political revolution. That is, it not only attempted to oust Joseph from the throne, but also embodied a, quote, religious war against the ideas of the French Revolution, end quote. Stotzer further asserts, Spain did not need to imitate Rousseau or Locke for popular sovereignty. It could look to its great tradition of late scholastic thinkers, particularly Suarez, to formulate its own conception of people power. Instead of the Protestant Enlightenment of Northwestern Europe, therefore, what ultimately informed the creation of Spanish American republics was the political ideology of the Spanish NeoScholastics. Returning to Jacinto's Liwanag at Dilim, we see in the section entitled Ang Bayan at ang mga pinuno, or the people and the government, the same assumption of the Suarezian formulation of popular sovereignty. Jacinto describes legitimate political authority thus, quote, Kaya nga't ang alinmang kapangyarihan upang maging tunay at matuwid ay sa bayan lamang at sa kanyang mga tunay na pinakakatawan dapat na manggaling. So that any authority or power, in order to be genuine and right, should come only from the people and its true body. Quote, Sa madaling salita, di dapat nating kilalanin ang pagkatao ng mga pinuno na mataas kaysa madla. Ang pagsunod at pagkilala sa kanila ay dahil sa kapangyarihang pinagkaloob ng bayan. Sa makatwid, ang kabuuan ng mga kapangyarihan ng bawat isa. In other words, he says, we should not think of the humanity of leaders as being superior to that of the people. The obedience paid to and the recognition of these rulers derived from the power that was imparted to them by the people, the sum total or the coming together of the power of every individual. He goes on to say, Sa bagay na ito, ang sumusunod sa mga pinunong inilagay ng bayan ay dito sumusunod, at sa parang ito'y nakikipag-isa sa kalahatan. At ang pakikipag-isang ito ay siyang daang-tangi ng kaayusang kinakailangan ng kabuhayan ng bayan. In this matter, he says, those that follow the leaders appointed by the people consequently follow the people, and through this harmonize with the whole. And this unity is the only way to maintain the social order necessary to sustain the people. This passage clearly demonstrates a close adherence to the neo-scholastic configuration of political rights as residing in the entire body of the people and not in any of its constituent parts. Far from the more Anglo-Protestant notion of a kind of possessive individualism, where the individual subject is seen as the locus of political right, civil authority is here presented as being engendered by the willful merging of various individual powers into a larger sovereign whole. Bayan thus takes on the same kind of undifferentiated collectivity that Coronado associates with the Spanish term pueblo, arguing that pueblo, quote, carries with it the scholastic concept of the corpus mysticum, the mystical living body that can only emerge by the coming together of a mass of an indivisible people, end quote. Jacinto further emphasizes that the authority of this ruling regime stemmed from the power that has been conferred upon it by its very own subjects, assuming the Suarezian doctrine of the transfer of civil potestas, or authority from the people to their chosen rulers. Working from this first principle of neo-scholastic popular sovereignty, Jacinto then justifies revolution. Throughout Liwanag at Dilim, he paints the Philippine colonial situation as a state of war between the Spanish regime and the Tagalog people. In the section Ang Tao'y Magkakapantay, for instance, he speaks of the state's minions, mga hamak na galamay, presumably referring to reactionary friars, as the dogs joining the government in drinking the blood of the people, makasalo sa pag-inom ng dugo ng bayan. Far from ensuring the common good, this ruling state has thus proven itself a tyrant, sucking the lifeblood out of the very people it was meant to protect, vindicating the people's right to revolt in the name of self-defense, the one right, as already discussed, that the Jesuit neo-scholastics deemed fundamentally inalienable. While it may seem ironic for the origins of Philippine revolutionary thinking to have been influenced by the political theology of the imperial center itself, the situation might make more sense once we recognize that the Catholic world, even at the time of the Counter-Reformation, was deeply divided. Besides challenging the growing Protestant constituency, the 16th century NeoScholastics, in fact, also aimed at repudiating the legitimacy of Spain's expanding imperial enterprise. Contact with different peoples made the Neo-Scholastics question the extent of the political authority of the Spanish king, especially if all men were purportedly free and equal under the dictates of natural law. Francisco de Vitoria, prime professor of theology at the University of Salamanca, who inspired two generations of Neo-Scholastics, including Suarez, earned the reputation of being the father of international law by investigating this new intercontinental order. Vitoria was lecturing at a time when Spain's central concern was the defense of its self-imposed role as guardian of global Christianity, and thus had enlisted its theologians to the task of ensuring its actions adhered, or at least gave the impression of adhering, to Christian ethics. In a series of public lectures in the 1530s, Vitoria came to the defense of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. He argued that men, simply by being creatures of God, regardless of religious affiliation, were born free and rational under natural law, and therefore had rights to their own territories and the administration of their own civil affairs. This made any claim to the legitimacy of the Spanish conquest based on a purported lack of rights on the part of the American natives utterly invalid. His arguments were essentially reproduced by Bartolomé de las Casas in Las Casas' own famous 1550 debate with Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, the leading defender of the Spanish conquest. While these theological debates were held after the fact of the discovery and conquest of Mexico and Peru, they were happening while the subordination of the Philippine Islands was still very much an active process. These Valladolid conferences, in fact, took place after Ferdinand Magellan stumbled upon the archipelago in 1521 and before Miguel López de Legazpi established the first official Spanish colonial settlement in Cebu in 1565. As historians John Phelan and Horacio de la Costa have argued, the archipelago became a testing ground for a less sanguinary invasion to ameliorate the distressed conscience of the king after the carnage that just occurred in the Americas. Phelan, in fact, points specifically to Vitoria's influence on Philip II's instructions to the conquistador Legazpi, saying that the extraordinary document ordering a peaceful occupation of the islands, quote, could have been lifted almost verbatim from the lectures of the Dominican theologian Francisco de Vitoria delivered at the University of Salamanca, end quote. Later, in 1597, the same king nominated Francisco Suarez as prime professor of theology at the University of Coimbra, an important detail for this study, as Coimbra at the time was particularly intended for the intellectual formation of missionaries about to be sent out to the New World. This strongly suggests the substantial impact of Suarezian thought on the friars delegated to the various Spanish dominions, anticipating the vast influence of Suarez's philosophies on the university curricula of the Hispanic world in the following centuries. Remarkably, as de la Costa points out, Francisco Suarez's own younger brother, Gaspar Suarez de Toledo, was part of the first commission of Jesuits to be sent from Acapulco to Manila in 1579, but died en route. And as further evidence of the Neo-Scholastic influence on the conquest of the islands, Domingo de Salazar, the first appointed bishop of the Philippines, was a student of Vitoria and a disciple of Las Casas. Furthermore, the first Manila Junta of 1582, which was centered around the legitimacy of Spain's presence in the islands, continued to revisit Vitoria's arguments. Thus, these Catholic ethico-political principles formulated during the Counter-Reformation were very much in active circulation and use in Spain's international affairs with the Philippines from the very inception of Spanish-Philippine relations.
Okay, great.
Finally,
sorry.
Yes.
So, all right, could you please begin to wrap up? You've only got 2 minutes left.
Okay, cool. Yes, I'll wrap up soon. In emphasizing the scholastic influence on Jacinto's writing, I wish to chip away at the pervasive image of the Tagalog revolutionary corpus as somehow being more indigenous and less Western because of its language. That is, in the scholarship on these sources, there seems to be an implied correct version, which engages in a kind of sterilization of these documents from any resonance of European inflected thought, Yet in our efforts to push back against a dominant elite narrative, we sometimes, to my mind, draw too hard of a line between folk and foreign, which subsequently causes us to overlook the rich dynamism and transnational inheritance of our Tagalog language archives and propagate the assumption that linguistic difference will map neatly onto ideological difference. Even in the supposedly untouched Tagalog imaginary, as we have seen, we find resonances of the Counter-Reformation in Europe. True, Jacinto did spend his entire life in the colony without the international exposure that Rizal had, but the point is he didn't have to step outside the archipelago to encounter Europe. The fact that he was educated at the Colegio de San Juan de Letran and studied law and philosophy at the University of Santo Tomas meant that he was educated the Spanish way, inculcated with a distinctly Spanish Catholic view of politics. This intellectual formation also suggests that he would have been exposed to the works of Aquinas even before those of Rousseau, as USD was a bastion of scholasticism throughout all of Spanish rule. Instead of isolated thinkers, therefore, I encourage us to approach our revolutionary theoreticians as legitimate inheritors of a truly transnational synergism of thought, from 16th century scholasticism to the French Enlightenment to the various revolutionary philosophies across Europe and the Americas. Thanks, I'm done.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for your presentation, Johaina.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank the conference organizers for making this happen during these challenging times and giving me this opportunity to speak in front of you from afar. My presentation today is entitled Competitive Love, the Transimperial Paradigm of Friendship and Affective Economies in the Spanish Colonization of the Philippines. It looks at how European imperial powers mobilized the idiom of friendship in their competitive claiming of the Philippines and their dealing with the indigenous Filipinos during the 16th and 17th centuries, and how the indigenous Filipinos engaged in this inter-imperial politics of friendship. So my work is in line with recent scholarship on the intimate and affective frontiers of empire and on the Spanish Empire in particular, which argues that Spanish colonialism did not depend solely on brute force or mere violence. But this is not to turn blind eyes to colonial violence. Here I would like to begin with a quote by the anthropologist and Stoller, quote, "To study the intimate is not to turn away from colonial dominations, but to relocate their conditions of possibility and relations and forces of production," end quote. So one of the conditions of possibility for colonial domination in the Philippines that I want to look at in particular today is the concept of friendship. My overarching argument is that the discourse and practice of friendship constituted a transimperial paradigm among European powers in their imperial expansion in the Philippines and elsewhere. The paradigm gave rise to their competitive friend-making with native peoples in order to justify their contested presence and secure native succor and collaboration. This inter-imperial politics of friendship also recast native agency in negotiating with multiple imperial powers and resisting colonial rule. What I mean by the transimperial paradigm of friendship is that early modern European empires shared basic assumptions and models of expansion rooted in classical antiquity and Christianity. And some of those assumptions and models were about friendship. If we look into early modern European documents pertaining to colonialism, we will find the word friendship or its equivalent in other European languages here and there. So the discourse and practice of friendship constituted a transimperial reservoir of knowledge and narratives accessible to imperial agents in European metropoles and colonies. As the prime model of empire, the Roman Empire used its interstate or interpolity friendship and treaty making for imperial expansion. So they treated subordinate kings as friends and servants. So friendship could be asymmetrical, resembling patron and client relationship. For example, the Spanish and Portuguese similarly use the terms friendship and vassalage together to refer to their imperial relations with Asian polities. We can also see that European empire builders similarly associated friendship with the feelings of love and goodwill. This is also a classical and Christian legacy shared among these empires. The collective imperial knowledge on friendship included not only philosophical reflections on its nature by European thinkers, but also practical knowledge on friendly conduct in interpersonal and international relations. Early modern jurists such as Francisco de Vitoria and Hugo Grotius drew upon classical thought or Christian thought to justify imperial expansion through treaty making and international friendship. The Dominican Francisco de Vitoria invoked the concept of friendship in conjunction or amicitia in Latin, in conjunction with the Roman concept of law of the nations to argue for the right of natural partnership and communication. If the Amerindians or the Indians in the Americas, if they deny the Spaniards this right of natural partnership, the Spaniards were justify the use of violence in their colonization of the Americas. That's his argument. So Vitoria's theory influenced generations of Spanish missionaries in the Philippines and also Portuguese missionaries elsewhere. And for the Dutch, Hugo Grotius also will treaty making as a just norm of the emergent international law system. He also defended Dutch attacks against the Portuguese in Southeast Asia as legitimate acts of alliance with Southeast Asian rulers. So treaty signing provided imperial empires with a crucial means of competitive friend making under a shared legal paradigm. Friendship served to build mutual recognition and prevent hostile acts between strangers in their encounters. It also signified native consent in claims of territorial possession and show conformity to legal norms. Now let's focus on the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. I want to argue that competitive friend making among European powers in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines in particular generated affective economies of friendship. Economy here is used in both literal and figurative senses. On the one hand, as a relation of production, distribution, and transaction between Europeans and natives, an economy gave rise to friendship and its affectivity or feelings. Economic activities were thought to promote love and amity, which in turn allow for Christian evangelization to proceed effectively. On the other hand, friendship and its affectivity were also integral to the formation and transformation of an economy. Through friendship and treaty making, European military alliance or protection was usually exchanged for commercial privileges from the natives. And also in the figurative sense, I use affective economy to signify the dissemination of affect or feelings in the friendly interaction between Europeans and Filipinos. We can see many affective descriptions of friendship in European records, just as the Europeans compete with one another in attracting native friendship. Affective exchanges worked to create coalitions and opposition in the region. As Sarah Ahmed explains, affective economies were crucial to the delineation of individual and collective identities. The intensity of emotional attachment creates boundaries and allies individuals with communities. In the context of the Philippines and nearby islands, colonial relations were conceived as formed and animated and demarcated through affective circulation. This included not only positive affects such as love and goodwill, but also dread and fear. Here I would like to discuss the Spanish-Portuguese struggle during the Villalobos expedition in 1543 and just some remarks about the competition between the Spanish and Dutch. In February 1543, the Villalobos expedition from Mexico reached Mindanao. The fleet searched for food and took Sarangani Island by force and drove the natives off to Mindanao. They also came into a battle with local inhabitants in nearby islands. These hostile encounters were reported to Jorge de Castro, Portuguese Captain General of Ternate and the Spice Islands, by his native allies in Mindanao. So Castro began to correspond with Villalobos. His first letter not only held that the Villalobos fleet had intruded into the Portuguese hemisphere regardless of the friendship and kinship and agreement between the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, intimating his firm procurement of native friendship. Castro also claimed that the native of Mindanao, with whom the Portuguese usually bartered, had sent him complaints on the Spanish depredations against them and asked for his help. Castro maintained that his maritime route, with trading ships from India and Malacca traveled to the Moluccas, had belonged to the Portuguese crown. The Portuguese ships had been sailing this route regularly with much peace, quiet, and tranquility of the native. They were, quote, very content without any constraint whatsoever, but out of their own wills that have signed for many years the said peace and friendship, end quote, with the Portuguese king and his vassals. He claimed that the Portuguese not only earned commercial profit with the native as their providers for merchandise and sustenance, they could also attract indigenous Muslims and convert them to Christianity. This was also the case in Mindanao, where the Villalobos fleet was staying. Some indigenous rulers had even abandoned their own lands to live with their families at the Portuguese fortress in Ternate. So by showing how Portuguese Christianization succeeded and resulted in native friendship and security, Castro pointed that the Spaniards, in contrast, trespassed upon the Portuguese zone and brought harm to indigenous community. Such acts not only went against the service of God and the Portuguese crown, but also risked jeopardizing the local Portuguese and arousing native treasury due to their commonality as Christian co-religionists. So Castro, while denying the legitimacy of the Spanish presence, earnestly asserted the Portuguese rights of possession over this island through the Treaty of Zaragoza, the rule of first occupancy, and their treaty of peace and friendship with the natives. So Villalobos responded to Castro's allegations by claiming that the damage done by his fleet against the native was very minimal and forced by the natives themselves, since he had been subjected to their treachery despite his best treatment of them. To this, Castro demanded on behalf of the Portuguese crown that the Villalobos fleet leave Mindanao and the Portuguese sphere of possession. He maintained that since Villalobos had confessed to his harm against the natives because of their refusal to his landing, their friendship with the Portuguese and respect for the Portuguese crown were evident, such that they accept no other authority. So in this manner, friendship served as a transimperial trope in the European context and competitive justification of imperial pursuits in Southeast Asia. Here, competitive friend-making entailed effective contention, as the Portuguese justified their presence against the Spaniards partly by contrasting between their respective acts of love and harm toward the natives. The accumulation of such affective values as amity and contentment was claimed to propel the Portuguese indigenous trade and consolidate their intimate friendship. To lay claim to the Philippines and the Moluccas, the Portuguese laid claim to signs of the exclusive amicability and amity of their indigenous populace. So commerce, contract, and conversion were brought together as forming and animating their effective economy of friendship, which sustained the Portuguese by guaranteeing their economic exchange with the natives. This, however, was allegedly interrupted by the Spaniards with their physical violence as well as legal and moral violations. The proximity of the Spaniards was perceived as a potential injury to the Portuguese indigenous union. Finally, the Villalobos fleet succumbed to hunger because they couldn't secure native friendship and therefore local supplies, so they yielded to the Portuguese at the Spice Island. And at the turn of the 17th century, the power dynamics and affective economies between the Iberians and the indigenous Filipinos were disrupted by the arrivals of the Dutch and English. As, quote, an empire by treaty par excellence, end quote, the Dutch Empire sought to obtain commercial privileges and colonial possession while outstripping its European adversaries through native friendship. For example, in 1598, Maurice, Prince of Orange, sent an armada to, quote, contract friendship with certain foreign nations and kingdoms, end quote, on the coasts of Asia, Africa, and America. In his letter to be presented to local rulers, he claimed that the Spanish and Portuguese were hostile to the natives of these regions and obstructed their navigation and commerce, contrary to our natural rights of our cities and nations. So in this manner, Maurice turned the law of nations, which Imperial Spain had earlier mobilized in its conquest of the Americas and the Philippines, against the Spaniards themselves. On this account, he dispatched an armada under Olivier van Noort to the East Indies, quote, to resist and make war on and harm and injure as far as possible all the said Spanish and Portuguese, end quote. So Maurice's expedition exemplified early Dutch challenges to the Iberian monopoly in Southeast Asia and the Philippines. Through the rhetoric of international friendship, it undermined Iberian legitimacy and at the same time legitimized its own offensive intervention. So at this point, you might ask, and what about the natives? So I want to go along by discussing some last question of this presentation. How did the indigenous Filipinos participate in or respond to European competitive friend-makings? And in so doing, how did inter-imperial competition condition their agency? So as long as imperial sustenance and legitimacy rested on native friendship, competitive friend-making potentially empowered the natives to negotiate and configure their relations with various foreign nations. And so European competitive friend-making gave rise to what we can call a double politics of comparison. On the one hand, as we have seen, European empire builders vie for imperial legitimacy by contrasting the treatments of the natives and their exclusive requirement of native amity. And on the other hand, to endure multiple imperial powers in the region, Philippine natives compare the socio-political and economic conditions that different European empires offer or impose upon them. Imperial competitive friend-making therefore opened up for natives the possibility to oscillate or straddle between competing power. So to understand native agency in the context of competitive friend-making, it helps to look into the effective structure of native orientation toward European friendship. From native perspectives, a friendship or alliance with certain Europeans was desirable precisely because of its accompanying promises. A European friendship provided the natives with the promise of betterment, especially in regard to their existing affairs with indigenous or foreign others. On the one hand, European friendship was imagined as enabling them to earn prestige or material benefits, realize upward mobility, or gain the edge on their opponents in local politics. Indigenous alliance and service were often rewarded with positions in the military or local colonial administration, or even with land grants, allowing indigenous elites to preserve their privileged status and accumulate wealth. But on the other hand, competitive friend-making offered indigenous colonial subjects, such as Filipinos under the Spanish crown and its encomenderos, an alternative to their vassalage and servitude. Colonial subjugation and exploitation often forced native subjects, especially non-elites, to seek for a means of endurance, of self-empowerment, or ultimately self-emancipation. Imperial competitive friend-making and its politics of comparison gave rise to native fantasies, if you will, of reorganizing their modes of living with the Europeans, amicable and less vertical, as opposed to abusive domination under colonial rule. So with such phantasmatic thinking, the natives were potentially impregnated with a wide range of feelings, from anxiety and revolutionary enthusiasm to the ardor of anticipating an imagined community to come. Such affective intensity could force and fortify their love and attachment to their particular European friends, and eventually instigate native resistance to colonial rule in prospect of radical change.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah.
Okay, sorry. Could you please wrap up, Arthit?
Okay, sure.
Okay, thank you.
So to give you an example, I want to turn to the incursion of English pirates into the Philippines just a decade after the Spanish colonial government was established. So in 1587, an expedition of English privateers under Thomas Cavendish intercepted and burned a Spanish ship on the coast of New Spain and then sailed westward to the Philippines. They arrived at Cabul Island in northern Samar in early 1588, bought victuals from local natives, and hung the Spanish pilot of the captured ship. After staying over a week, Cavendish gathered all the chieftains of Cabul and of 100 islands more, whom he had made to pay him tribute, and announced that they were Englishmen and enemies of the Spaniards. According to an English eyewitness account here, the native chiefs, quote, promised both themselves and all the islands thereabout to aid him whensoever he should come again to overcome the Spaniards, end quote. In token that they were likewise inimical to the Spaniards, in opposition to the Spaniards, Cavendish gave them money for their tribute, which they took marvelously friendship. A Spanish official reported similarly that the Englishmen told the native of Cabul that they had left their country for the sole purpose of harming the Spaniards. They also expressed an intention to return with the fleet within 3 years in order to drive the Spaniards out and settle in the archipelago, and said that they did not care for any tribute from the Indians, but only for their friendship and trade. Although the English didn't return, and the incident showed that the English friendship held out the promise of decolonization, if you will, that gave the indigenous Filipinos some sense of alternative form of relationship with the Europeans. So last example before I finish this presentation is the Sumuroy Revolt in Palapat in northern Samar. Here, the Spanish-Dutch struggles similarly involve native fantasies of colonial emancipation and non-hierarchical friendship. According to a recollect missionary account, during their attack on Cavite, the Dutch during their attack on Cavite in 1648, they came into contact with native chieftains and gave them to understand that, quote, they would only treat them as friends and not in the domineering manner of the Spaniards, who, they said, treat them as slaves, end quote. Like the Cavendish fleet 6 decades earlier, The Dutch promised the native that they would return with a larger fleet in the following year and hoped to find the native prepared so that they could shake off such heavy chains of the Spanish with Dutch munitions. Although the Dutch failed to deliver their promise as a result of the Peace of Munster, which ended the Dutch War of Independence, their proposition spread from one island to another and was quote, agreeable to them all because of the liberty it seemed to promise, end quote. So the situation was exacerbated by the Spanish governor's order that a number of families across the archipelago leave their hometowns for service at the shipyards of Cavite. So as a result, the natives began to arrange seditious movement against Spanish authorities, beginning in Palapac in northern Samar. So half a century after the event, the Augustinian Fray Camisero Diaz wrote that the insurgents had claimed that two Dutch ships were coming to aid them, as quote, as they were fellows in the rebellion against the shirt and the bond of vassalage to the Spanish crown. And this is a very important quote. And this fiction was of great support to their evil attempts, he continued. So this quote suggests the affective forces of the promise of Dutch friendship and their liberatory fantasy. Okay, I'll probably wrap up this slide later on. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Arthit. Thank you so much for your presentation.
So, anyway, thank you so much. First, let me start thanking the organization of the conference for making this little miracle happen, of having this conference virtually with some of us in the American continent, some of us in Europe, some of us in Asia. I mean, this is amazing. So I would love to be in person in the Philippines, meeting all of you, but I'm sure we'll have some other opportunities in the future. I'm sure this crisis will pass and we'll have many more in-person conferences. In the meantime, this is wonderful. So thank you so much. So my presentation today is titled Reencountering Islam in Mindanao, Race and Religion at the Threshold of Spain's Modernity. I'm writing a book right now analyzing Spanish texts written between the 16th and 19th centuries, so during all the Spanish presence in the islands, that deal with Spanish-Muslim relations in the Philippines. And I am particularly interested in how these texts can help us to understand the concepts of race, religion, lineage in the Spanish Empire, and how they changed throughout the centuries. Obviously, this is a very wide topic, and I hope that I can write a book about it, the whole book. But today I'm going to focus just on a brief analysis of two of these writings. The arrival of the Spanish in the Philippines and the process of conquest and colonization that ensued produced a reencounter with Islam in a most unexpected and unique place. In the Philippines, the Spanish were in an eccentric point, in a physically and symbolically hostile space, where there is a real threat of literal and symbolic disintegration and annihilation. On the other hand, however, in the Philippines, the Spanish occupy an indisputable position of authority, especially once they have conquered most of the archipelago, with the small but fundamental exception of the southern islands, especially Mindanao, precisely the areas occupied by Muslims. The Philippines, therefore, is a mixed, ambiguous, and ambivalent space for the Spaniards in a strange and complex colonial environment complicated by the unexpected presence of Muslims. The representation of this new reality will be to a large extent a recreation of already existing and widely disseminated codes to address Islam, but renewed by the special conditions under which they are elaborated in this new framework. Zamboanga is undoubtedly the geographical point that symbolizes the Spanish anxieties around its presence in the southern Philippines and the confrontation with Islam in the archipelago. In two essential writings that analyze this topic, the history of Mindanao and Zulu, of Historia de Mindanao y Jolo by Francisco de Combes, and the historical political dissertation by Fray José Torrubia, the city of Zamboanga's fort is the catalyst for these strategies, the disputes and the interests that arise in relation to Islam in the Philippines. Both texts reveal the urgency to control politically, but also textually, the instability that characterizes Spanish power in these territories, and by extension, its relationship with Islam in the Philippines. The arrival of the Spaniards gave way to a series of political military fights that determined life in the southern islands for generations. Between 1599 and 1635, there were active rebellions against Spanish power. In 1635, the Zamboanga fort was established and Muslim resistance grew. Threatened by a possible Dutch attack in Manila and exhausted by the ineffectiveness of their efforts, the Spaniards were forced to establish peace treaties with Muslim rulers. However, these treaties did not last for long. Finally, the Spaniards left Zamboanga and the other forts in the area in 1663, afraid of a Chinese attack in Manila led by the corsair Coxinga or Coxeng in Spanish texts. During the following 50 years, attacks between the two forces took place, but the Spanish did not return to Zamboanga or reopen the fort until 1618. In the first years of Spanish occupation, numerous participants in the conquest associated Filipino Muslims to the totality of Islam as continuators of Turks, Tunisians, or Egyptians that Christianity had to confront in past and present times. Melchor de Avalos, a judge of the Manila Audiencia, describes them in 1585 as descendants of Granada and other enemies of Spain. Evangelization was understood as a pivotal part of the conquest, as we know, and the religious orders carried great weight in its implementation. It's important to underline, though, that the conflict was not understood in racial terms, since the racial origin of Muslim and non-Muslim populations at the moment of the Spanish arrival was the same, basically. The confrontation was determined from the very beginning by religious elements that cannot be separated from the Spanish political ambitions in the area. For the Spaniards, the Zulus and Maguindanaos were simply Moros, the enemy with whom they had struggled since time immemorial. The Historia de Mindanao y Jolo, History of Mindanao and Sulu, by Francisco de Combes, is part of a larger propagandistic network created by the Jesuits to discredit the decision of leaving Mindanao by the civil authorities, attempting to make them reconsider the decision and go back to Zamboanga. Combes, like the other Jesuits who worked in the islands, understood that abandoning Zamboanga meant a failure that would spoil all the previous efforts with the indigenous populations, both Muslims and not Muslims. This is the main motivation of his writing. Nonetheless, the text transcends his primary intention and offers the most complete view available of the history of Mindanao and Sulu since the Spanish arrival, representing at the same time the perception and the process of understanding the Muslim other. Combes fluctuates continuously between two positions, sometimes demonizing Islam, repeating the official discourse that promoted the absolute rejection of a religion perceived as an enemy of Christianity. At other occasions, however, he also challenges common stereotypes and seems to try and build bridges that present as a real possibility the authentic conversion of these Muslims. It's clear that the historia's complex motivations, arguments, and opinions adapt themselves to the concrete needs of each moment, showing the confrontation with Islam and its nuances only as an instrument to reach other goals. Among these goals, there is an eagerness to celebrate Jesuit glories and their primordial place in politics and evangelization of the islands. The real heroes represented in the Historia or the history of Mindanao are Jesuit priests, because Combes is a Jesuit priest. Jesuit priests are surrounded with an almost superhuman aura of perfection, idealized without exception, in a labor of glorification that is one of the text's main supporting pillars. The propaganda is reinforced with the narration of several miracles carried out by priests or inspired by their great reference point and spiritual model, Saint Francisco Javier. At the same time, the account of these events attempts to rescue from the periphery the evangelization labor in such a marginal place as the southern Philippines, as compared to the rest of the territories managed by the Spanish monarchy, which Combes manifests, he defines the area as the point that closes the Spanish crown and the most defenseless and remote region in the Indies. We cannot forget that on several occasions, Sevilla, the city of Seville, sent out proposals for the abandonment not only of Mindanao and Sulu, but also of the entire Philippines, fearful as Spanish merchants were that transatlantic commerce would be affected if Mexico and Peru received cheaper Chinese silks via the Philippines. These merchants did not care much about the evangelical interests in the islands, but this was very different in the court of Madrid, where representatives of the religious orders that work in the Philippines reminded the king constantly of his commitment to convert Filipinos and at the same time avoid Dutch occupation of the islands. A book such as the Historia de Mindanao would be fundamental as a weapon of persuasion in court for the conservation of the Philippines in general and of Mindanao and Sulu in particular, using as a motivation the defeat of the Moros. Combes tries to create the unreal image of evangelical success in the Muslim islands and to transform Mindanao and Sulu, image and epitome of the failure of the confrontation with Islam and of the imperial difficulties in the Philippines, into a space symbolic of the redeeming power of faith for natives and for the colonizers themselves and their enterprise. He minimizes many times the implantation and scope of Islamic practices in the archipelago, while at others he highlights the importance of converting this population at any cost. Sometimes he separates Muslims from the rest of indigenous peoples as representatives of malice, treason, inflexibility, and extreme violence. And other times he offers models of admirable behavior, real examples of idealized neo-converts. He tries to explain that the inhabitants of Mindanao and Sulu, and I quote, are not Moors or Gentiles or Christians, but atheists, that they reject one of the signs of Muslim identity for the Spanish collective conscience, the fear abominable sin, removing them from the worst aspect of the representation of Islam at the time. The treatment, for example, of the imposing figure of Corralat, this is the name that the King of Mindanao has in the Spanish texts, personifies the tyranny associated with Muslims, their obstinacy, natural stubbornness, inconsistency, and hatred of the Catholic faith. And it is the epitome of alterity based on the differences with Islam. Nevertheless, on other occasions, Corralat is an exemplary leader who shows a truly noble spirit, generous and very alien, and I quote, to what is natural to his nation. The Spanish-Muslim encounter in the southern Philippines takes place in this moving space. And although some historians are surprised by the incapacity of Spaniards to interpret Filipino Muslims after centuries of contact with Islam, I think it was precisely this previous knowledge what obstructed the understanding of the reality of Mindanao and Sulu. With respect to Muslims, there are fewer questions, or their answers are difficult to rewrite because they have been inscribed in Spanish culture for centuries. Stereotypes were already fixed, and they inevitably invade the text. Homi Bhabha explains that the objective of colonial discourse is to construe the colonized as a population of degenerate types on the basis of racial origin in order to justify conquest and to establish systems of administration and instruction. Race in Spanish and early modern Spain was not color-coded, however, but was defined as a descent group of lineage and as a given religious identity. Religion is pivotal in the definition of race and the conception of race in Spain at this time. It is the Moorishness of this newly found population which serves as a translating mechanism and simultaneously and paradoxically as a creator of essential otherness based on religious difference. In the Philippines, the battles against Muslims started with the call to Santiago, St. James, the Moor slayer, and immediately brought to mind the times of their reconquest, of course. The celebrations of victories against Muslims tied these events with battles against the Turks or liberations of captives in Northern Africa, a common occurrence during the 16th and 17th centuries in the Iberian Peninsula. And they were usually presided, these celebrations, by images of Christ and San Francisco Javier, who is called the first apostle of Mindanao. This is the textual and ideological universe where Combes writes his text. The author moves among a variety of possible ways to codify the other, those that repeat and confirm the fixed positions established by tradition, and also, and herein lies the originality and complexity of this writing, those that question preconceived ideas after verifying that they do not respond to the needs of the multifaceted reality of this newfound world. His narrative is a form of colonial identification, and it can be seen as a mode of, and quoting Bhabha again, of differentiation realized as multiple cross-cutting determinations, polymorphous, perverse, and demanding a specific calculation of their effects. By emphasizing the conversions and the supposed miracles that accompany the Spanish presence in the Southern Islands, Combes indirectly tries to suggest the possibility of the great miracle of the conquest of Mindanao and Sulu, taking a chance on the Jesuit policy that defended the conservation of the forest in the south of Mindanao, in opposition to authorities more worried about not endangering the commerce in the archipelago, centered in Manila. The Historia de Mindanao y Jolo emerges above all as a text that reveals an unusual view of the colonial and evangelical projects in the Philippines, which are simultaneously produced for the peninsular imagination, which is appealed to in order to rescue the Jesuit work from the margins of the empire, moving it to the center of current discussions and concerns in the centers of power. The ambivalence of the text provokes contradictions because it tries to rhetorically unify a variety of discourses for the representation of Muslims in this colonial context. The Spanish Muslim contact in the Philippines redefines the ability to interpret and assimilate difference, and in this way it reconsiders also Spanish subjectivity that in many ways was constituted in opposition to this traditionally rejected other, to Islam. From this point of view, the periphery determines the center, destabilizes its foundations by opening the possibility of cracking categories that seem to be well fixed, but in reality are not so. I think this is the biggest achievement of this text, even if probably not consciously pursued, the capacity to open the way for the exploration of unknown spaces for the colonial subject through a representation superficially anchored in stability, but polyphonic and multifaceted in its essence. Combes tries to represent the colonial reality of the Southern Philippines for a public, for an audience, for readers that are in general completely unaware of the circumstances of what is happening on the islands, and for which the work of Combes could possibly be one of the very few opportunities to enter this world and to penetrate the peculiar Spanish-Muslim contact that took place in it. In this sense, the book is also an attempt to possess this colonial experience within a space over which there was no real authentic control, and which furthermore did not arouse a particular attraction from the civil or military authorities or from the leaders, commercial, as I will have already mentioned. Combes tries to recreate the unreal image of evangelization success in the Muslim islands. The old enemy was brought face to face again, and there was a new opportunity to defeat him, although the new environment and the difficulty of applying past knowledge to the present situation undoubtedly created disorientation and anxieties derived from failing. For Combes, the abandonment of the Southern Islands when leaving Zamboanga symbolizes this failure. This book is very, very important. This Historia de Mindanao and it will not be forgotten. And other later authors will draw inspiration from it to resume the debate about the Spanish control of Islam in the Philippines. Especially Zamboanga will once again be at the center of the debate in 1936, when the Franciscan José Torrubia published in Madrid his Disertación Histórica Política, en que se trata de la extensión del mametismo en las Islas Filipinas. Written in the form of dialogue with the aim of instructing, of teaching, the book proposes the defense of the Zamboanga fort as the best means of controlling the constant threat from Muslims against Spanish interest on the island of Mindanao and surrounding areas. To do so, it traces the history of Mindanao since the arrival of the Spanish, highlighting the instances when the abandonment of the fort led to the failure to control the south of the archipelago. Its main goal is to publicize the problems affecting the southern islands and to get the information to Madrid, since many in Manila, according to the author, did not seem to be sufficiently concerned about the constant threat from the Filipino Moros. For this reason, he reviews the history of the Spanish-Muslim confrontations, although he fears that, and I quote, not even the past fatigue of the peoples, waste of our weapons, dishonor of our nation, loss of our assets were enough eye drop for the blindness of sound eyes, and end quote. Zamboanga is the new Oran, as it were, and his loss will lead, according to Torrubia, to the same results, and I'm quoting again. While the Spanish had Oran, the Mediterranean was safe. After it was lost, the Moors of Oran were a sweeping net for our coasts. Once we took it again, the same safety as before is experienced, end quote. The regular Spaniard, to whom the text is addressed, knows the history in the Mediterranean much better than the history in the Philippines. And Torrubia appeals to this knowledge to make the Philippine reality much more distant and foreign understood. Also, the author, in his eagerness to arouse interest toward the fight against Islam in the Philippines, refines the image of Filipino Muslims and brings them closer to the reductionist stereotypes without nuances that may divert the reader from blindly supporting the anti-Muslim cause in Mindanao. The text reveals an urgency that leads to constant attack and propaganda in a much less nuanced way than Combes had done in the other book we just talked about. According to Torrubia, Muslims tortured, captivated, they hated the Catholic faith and constantly acted cruelly with, and I quote, so much robbery, so much sacrilege, so much captivity, so much fear and fright since the year of 1599, that they caused death of evangelical ministers, sacrilegious treatment of things sacred, pity of the neighbors, unbearable expenses to the royal treasury, continuous wars against the nation, damaging Christianity and preventing new conversions, end quote. The solution proposed by Torrubia for Mindanao is to maintain the fort of Zamboanga, which he considers as a fort so necessary to Christians to prevent the Moors from so swiftly going out to captivate our poor new Christians. The abandonment of the fort under the threat of the pirate Cochinga in 1663, narrated extensively in the Historia de Mindanao by Combes, is the core of the defense of Zamboanga, carried out also by Torrubia, who continuously emphasizes that this tactical error cost Spain the loss of control of Mindanao and in general of the southern Philippines for more than 50 years. Zamboanga is the symbol of the control of Mindanao, and it is constantly associated to the confrontation with Muslims in the Philippines. More than 5 decades after the publication of the history of Combes, the debate about staying or not, sorry, I got lost, just 1 second. The debate about staying or not in the south of the archipelago is drawn up again around this fort. The fact that the debate continues to take place indicates that this insistence on staying was never effectively questioned at any time from the beginning of the Spanish presence on the islands until as late as the 18th century. And in 1736, the danger of Islam continues to be the argument that has the best chance of tilting the balance in the decision made in Madrid, even now that the Habsburgs have been replaced by Bourbon Philip V. I'm wrapping up here already. In the Imperial collective consciousness at the time when the empire is in full decline, the anti-Islamic motive is still the easiest way to push for the defense of the Philippine Islands for many people in Spain, and more especially in the defense of Mindanao. Furthermore, the religious orders continue to be the defenders of this presence in Mindanao, and whether written by Jesuits or Franciscans, the texts that we have analyzed clearly indicate that during the 17th and 18th centuries, the Spanish colonization of the south of the Philippines cannot be understood without having Zamboanga, Mindanao, as a spatial and symbolic point of reference. The Spanish strategies for controlling the islands are played out in the Manila-Zamboanga-Madrid axis. Manila is the center of the colony, but as we have seen, several authors place Zamboanga in the foreground when they needed to present forceful arguments in Madrid that support the Spanish presence in the Philippines. It is in Mindanao and its surroundings where the Moros are. Moros whose mention in the 17th century, but also well into the 18th century, aroused anxieties well rooted in the Spanish conscience. Defeating them was one of the main motivations that encouraged, either by conviction or by strategy, a constant return to Zamboanga, a Christian and stronghold in Mindanao, the last hope of being able to control territories that actually, in reality, were never fully controlled. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anna, for your presentation. All right. So with that, thank you to all of our speakers for their presentations. This panel is now open for questions from the audience. So with that, I'd like to request Johaina and Arthit and Anna to unmute and switch on their videos. Okay, so do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, so actually I saw a couple of questions from YouTube. Let me read them out for you. Okay, so first off, from Veronica Alporja on YouTube. This is for Johaina. She wants to know, are there any indications that Jacinto actually read NeoScholastics, aside from his presumed exposure to these as he went to Letran and UST? And are NeoScholastic ideas taught in these Dominican schools?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I forgot that I'm already unmuted. Yeah, so that's actually like a really interesting question, and it's something that I'm also trying to figure out. Unfortunately, so I was supposed to be there, obviously, for the conference, but also to do archival work actually at UST, because I wanted to figure out what they were reading. Especially at the time when Jacinto was a student there. So currently the information I've had to rely on was actually there was Leo Colum wrote an article that was published actually by Philippine Studies, where he talks about the history of philosophy in the Philippines. And in the late 19th century, there was a healthy revival of scholasticism that were taught in these schools. And so so that was sort of indicated to me that scholasticism was still very much a big part of the curriculum. He also mentions Zeferino Gonzalez, who was a Dominican theologian who was sort of I think became a prime professor of theology in like UST, and then eventually led a brilliant scholastic renaissance when he went back to Spain. The other thing too about Suarez is that he became so, I think just throughout the course of like the 17th, 18th century, his teachings became so just widespread that they essentially turned into doctrine. So it was just sort of like, it just sort of like pervaded the university curricula throughout the Spanish world, as is evidenced by a lot of essentially like during the Cortes, it was his doctrine of pactum translationis, where essentially you have the power coming from the transfer of power from the people as a whole given to the king. And so because the king, there was like an absence of power on the throne, then that power goes back to the people. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for answering the question, Johaina. Any questions from the panel to their fellow speakers or from the audience present currently? Okay, so while we're waiting for questions, I wanted to ask Arthit about the term that he used, effective economies. Can you expound on the term effective economies a little bit more, please?
So effective economies, I borrowed this concept from Sarah Ahmed, who conceptualizes affect as or emotion as something that sticks, and it's not an emotion or affective state that resides in an individual, but something that circulated in between subjects, in between individuals, and as they circulate and traverse boundaries, they create this, this bond or attachment between people, and at the same time detachment, to some other people. So that's what I think at work in, the contest or competition between European powers in claiming and mobilizing the idiom of friendship, and also using the language of sentiments, in explicating their theories and justifying their claims. So the existing scholarship hasn't much talked about this affective language in imperial and colonial discourses. So I want to pick up, how these affective terms like love, friendship, amistad, amor, paz, or other related terms, meant in their own context, and how that contributed to, their justification or their, actual claim to these territories, and also to subjugate these, native peoples.
I see. Okay. Thanks so much for answering my question. And I see Leandro has a question as well. Okay, Leandro, please feel free to turn on your audio and video to ask the question.
Okay, hold on. I just can't seem to get the video. Anyway, never mind. I'll just go with the question. Addressed to Arthit. The use of the word friendship in your study, I find it very interesting. Wouldn't you say that friendship in a colonial context is still in service of mercantilism, with the goals of creating winning conditions for their own home colonial empires, vis-a-vis the opposite parties, colonial parties in the region? Isn't this kind of discourse also, in a way, was sort of exploited by American colonists when they first came over to the Philippines, to create this contrast between the bad empire and the good empire, and so on and so forth.
Just benevolent assimilation, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I can say that that they mobilize the same the exact same logic of colonial expansion, because the Americans came to the Philippines with this idea of industrial capitalism, right? And that was not based on, scholastic or neo-scholastic traditions, offered by the Salamancan theologian led by Francisco de Vitoria, which, let me return to Francisco de Vitoria. He, in his lecture in the mid 16th century, he mobilized, both natural law, the law of nations, and divine law, these three laws, in order to claim that the Spaniards had the right to travel, to dwell, and to trade in the Americas as long as they do, the natives no harm. And if they are denied those rights, they are, warranted to use force, in asserting those claims. I'm not sure if this, logic was also put to use by the Americans, but I can see the parallel, the analogy between, mercantilism idea rooted in scholastic, or, if you will, legal theology and philosophy on the one hand, and, the American industrial capitalism, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. I can see that parallel, but I'm not sure if that if they are the exact logics. I have to look more into, the American empire's modus operandi. But thank you for your question.
Thank you. I just found it very interesting that a lot of these, themes, recur and mimic itself through history.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for the motive of the blood compact, between the Spaniards, and natives, as as friendship, as a form of racialized friendship that was, initiated by the natives themselves. And in another chapter of my, my dissertation project, I will discuss about how, Spanish colonial historians transform or interpreted these, repeated rituals as, native consents to their domination, yeah.
I just wanted to, sorry, just a follow up, and I wanted to connect to Anna's topic about race and religion in Spain's modernity. I guess I just wanted to ask if you've encountered the same economic model of mercantilism in Islamic societies, or is it really more of an economy of friendship, of trading as equals, rather than a zero-sum game of winners and losers?
You mean inside Islamic society,
Islamic
or between Spanish and the Muslims?
Yeah, maybe within Islamic society and both, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can't talk a lot about how the societies worked in that sense. So I'm more familiar with the Spanish texts, and I only have the point of view, unfortunately, of how things are perceived by the Spanish writers. So I feel I don't want to have any great conclusions about how these societies work. I know how they were perceived to work by the Spaniards. That's what I know. What I can say, yeah, what I can say is that I was very interested actually in this presentation with the concept of friendship, etc., because I have never seen my topic through that lens, and I think it's very helpful for me, because even though the natives are the same basically as racially as we understand race, just paying attention to their ethnicity, that concept of friendship would never work with this population in the Southern Islands because they are Muslims. So that concept of friendship, of the concept of some type of, breach, of some type of, consent, or all these wonderful things that we just heard about, that would never be an option for Spaniards because they are Muslims, they are Moros, they are the enemy, and that changed completely how they approach these populations in the Southern Islands. So this is fascinating for me because it helped me. I've been doing research about how slavery was seen differently for Muslims and non-Muslims, for example, right? And some other different concepts, but this other new concept for me of friendship, and that what it implies and the connections to scholastic philosophies, etc. This opens up a wonderful field for me because it's going to give me, completely different turn into my research. What is interesting in Combes, the first text I analyzed today, is that you can see that almost attraction, almost will to create some kind of different relation with these peoples, but there is suddenly this pull because they're Muslims, and so that was the paradox, the many paradoxes that I see in this book. So again, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation that really helps me a lot to reconsider things from a different point of view. And it actually ties also with Johaina's presentation because she was talking about all these things, right? And scholastics and Victoria, etc. Yeah, so, right. I mean, it's not the same as getting to meet you in person and having maybe a glass of wine after the panel, but it has been amazing. It has been amazing. So this is great. And thank you for your question, Leandro. It's a very, very good question that makes me keep thinking about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the wonderful presentation and for the great questions as well. I'm glad that you were all able to connect over the topics of your papers. Great. It's wonderful. All right. So once again, thank you so much for participating in this panel. Please do join us again in the next session of the conference later today. Well, of course, if you can still make it. I understand that for some it's already time for bed. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great evening or a great day, depending on where you are.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
for being here. That has been great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
All right, thank you.